Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining. This is the second event in a short series on Palestine and climate justice. My name is Rafi Arifin. I'm an assistant professor in geography at UBC, where I'm also a member of the Center for Climate Justice and a member of UBC faculty for Palestine. A few weeks ago, we hosted Palestinian political ecologist Mona Dejani, and today's event continues our focus on Palestine and climate justice, co-hosted with the Climate and Community Project. I'll be in conversation with our guests, Batul Hassan and Patrick Bigger. But I'd like to start with the acknowledgement first that the Center for Climate Justice is on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral land of the Musqueam people. At the Center for Climate Justice, we're working to ensure that this acknowledgement is taken seriously and the responsibilities it necessitates are at the heart of the center's efforts, engaging First Nations and Indigenous struggles near and far. Recent months have seen reactionary responses to Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, from the reversal of policies that secured Indigenous rights in New Zealand and the unsuccessful constitutional referendum in Australia, to the recent pause of amendments to the Land Act here in British Columbia. Now, in the face of rising reactionary and fascist responses to decolonization and liberation, the time really is now for political education that connects the dots between seemingly localized struggles to build international connections and solidarity. It's this exact kind of political education that Colombian President Gustavo Petro engaged in when at last year's climate conference in Dubai, COP28, he stated, quote, "What we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. What we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future." Now, this future was captured in a microcosm at last year's COP. Before traveling to Dubai, the Israeli Environmental Protection Minister told the Jerusalem Post, quote, "The climate crisis does not disappear, even in these complex days when Israel is fighting on the battlefield. We must continue and act on the issue of climate here in Israel and globally. Israel's participation in COP is crucial." Now, this, I'd argue, is the exact future that Petro is warning us of. A future where a state committing genocidal violence against a population and land it keeps under siege and occupation can also position itself as a crucial actor in solving the complexity of climate change. How is this rhetorical feat achieved? The climate emergency must be depoliticized, right? And presented as a kind of technical problem, a problem that is disconnected from actors like settler colonial states, fueled by extractive economies, entrenching the structural drivers of the climate crisis, namely colonialism, militarism, imperialism, and capitalism. On display at Israel's COP Pavilion was exactly this future, a presentation of 4 climate startup companies from the regions around Gaza, a performance of technical climate solutions amidst a genocide. The United States condemned the Colombian president's statements, not only because they dared to apply international law to Israel, but also because his comments synthesize struggles across geographies and across so-called issue silos. Petro's statements also synthesize across time, connecting a present tense genocide with genocides of both the past and future. So what does this rehearsal tell us? Well, at the Center for Climate Justice, we're calling this fascism's long arc, and it carries several important lessons. So among them, climate justice requires sovereignty over lands, but also sovereign production of knowledge to tend and care for the land. Israel has destroyed or rendered inoperable every single one of the 11 universities in Gaza. The Islamic University of Gaza, Al-Azhar University, Al-Quds Open University, University College of Applied Sciences, University of Palestine, Isra University, University of Gaza, Al-Aqsa University, Palestine Technical College, Palestine College of Nursing, and Arab College of Applied Sciences. 11 universities. Israeli attacks have killed hundreds of educators and academics and injured hundreds more. Palestinian scholar Karma Nabulsi called this kind of destruction scholasticide, the systemic destruction of a population's pedagogical systems and educators. Maya Win demonstrates how Israeli institutions of higher education have not only been silent about this destruction, but have been long complicit and active forces in Palestinian repression. What institutions will train the many Gazan engineers, social scientists, soil scientists, hydrologists, among others, needed not for the reconstruction of the status quo, but for an environmentally just, liberated Palestine? Scholasticide is a climate justice issue. Calls for climate justice are also about intervening in everyday lives, right? To remake our economies and societies. And so much of this work is done through infrastructure. The destruction of Gaza's universities is part of a larger tactic, the tactic of herbicide. Herbicide is the targeting and destruction of basic urban infrastructures, housing, electricity, sewage plants, water and wastewater treatment plants, right? With the aim of disabling city life in the present and into the future. Palestinian undergraduate research, Hamad Jaber here at UBC is documenting this tactic. And in a report, he writes, quote, herbicide directs our attention to the systematic, deliberate material consequences of urban warfare, rather than engaging in the work of untangling intent from the narratives propagated by a state known for spreading misinformation. Geographer Stephen Graham has argued this kind of warfare, which targets the underlying structures of city life, is the hallmark of contemporary warfare, from the 2003 Iraq War to what we are seeing today in Gaza. How can we re-envision infrastructure anywhere for a just future when Gaza's built environment is being reduced to a toxic rubble poisoning generations to come? Herbicide is a climate justice issue. Now, while the scenes of urban destruction fill our TV screens and our social media feeds, the destruction of Gaza's non-urban lands and livelihoods fall out of maybe immediate view. The Guardian reported that while the full extent of the damage in Gaza has not yet been documented, satellite imagery shows that Israel has destroyed about 38 to 48% of Gaza's tree cover and farmland. Ecocide, perhaps it goes without much saying, is a climate justice issue. And yet our governments and state institutions here in North America consistently refuse to name these patterns as crimes against humanity and wages a kind of multi-pronged information war against those of us who feel a duty, a moral duty, to describe and denounce them. And so it must be that Petro is right. What we are seeing in Gaza is a rehearsal of the future, a future where scholasticide, herbicide, and ecocide are not only incidental, but perhaps necessary to any apolitical solution to the climate crisis that severs it from its root drivers and institutions. Institutions like genocidal militaries bent on solving political questions of popular liberation with state violence. To again quote Gustavo Petro, Gaza is just the first experiment in considering us all disposable. But Gaza is also teaching us how to resist and reconfigure this rehearsal. In a recent visit to UBC, Palestinian scholar Shireen Sekali responded to my question about the role of the climate movement in resisting genocide. She replied, mass movements from climate to labor are actually already doing so. They're already doing this. And we can see this in the outpouring of people into the streets of cities around the world, week after week, in support of Palestine. But why do people keep showing up? Shireen argued it is because people around the world are seeing in the struggle of Palestinians glimpses of their own struggles, captured by the question, how can we hold ground while the earth beneath our feet is disappearing? That is, of course, a question for Palestine and Palestinians, but also for everyone living where seas are rising, where glaciers are disappearing, and rivers are drying. One answer to this question, how can we hold ground, is through political education that really illuminates the contours of shared struggles. So with that, I'm happy to be here with Batul Hassan and Patrick Bigger. Batul is a policy manager at the Climate and Community Project, where Patrick serves as the research director. Batul and Patrick have been involved in path-breaking research, in my view, on the climate costs of militarism and really centering Palestine in struggles over climate justice. So for the rest of our time together, Batul and Patrick will present from a few different CCP reports, which are being linked in the chat now, and discuss a little bit, hopefully some new research on military emissions. I'll then ask Batul and Patrick some follow-up questions, and we'll turn to some questions from the audience, and I encourage you to submit them throughout the talk, anytime really, using the Q&A function. And don't be shy, the questions will also be anonymous. So I'll pass it off to you two, Patrick and Batul.
Thanks so much. I'm going to start us off. Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks to everyone at CCJ for pulling this event together and to everyone who showed up tonight to collectively think through with us the military-industrial complex's outsized role, not just in our world and our lives, but also more specifically in our struggle for climate justice and for winning the fully decarbonized and livable world where all people and ecosystems can thrive. We have some of our reports up here that we'll be talking through tonight. As you can see, this has been a lot of collaboration with a lot of colleagues and allies in various reports and papers. We want to make sure to acknowledge their work. In particular, I want to mention the climate scholar Khalil Abu Yahya, who is cited in our organizational piece. He was killed with his family in October in Gaza, and I think it's important to recognize his work tonight. I'll link his piece that we cited specifically later in the chat. But our comments tonight are based on 3 recent publications. The first is our organizational briefing, Ceasefire Now, Ceasefire Forever, on why genocide in Palestine is a climate justice issue. The second is a collaboration with Commonwealth UK on the climate costs of US and UK military operations since 2015. The third is a working paper that Patrick and his colleagues put together on the climate dimensions of the genocide in Gaza. So he'll be speaking on that in a bit. But in this talk, we wanted to start by discussing more broadly the climate and ecological impacts of the ongoing genocide, and then slowly zoom out and look at how these horrifying processes are enmeshed in the political economies of violence, throughout which we find the US military-industrial complex. So this is just a blurb from our piece. I'm sure that many of us come to the climate movement with, a general understanding that the climate crisis is a crisis of global imperialism. We always hear the global South is impacted most by the climate crisis, even as the global North is contributing to its drivers the most. And this imbalance continues through historic and ongoing patterns of settler colonialism, capitalism, capitalist exploitation, resource extraction and use. And this is true even within the supply chains that we're seeing emerge for decarbonization, which is obviously so urgently needed, but also needs to be planned and democratized to ensure we're not just repeating mistakes of the past or further embedding existing impressions into our future system. So in other words, the urgency of the climate crisis reads differently depending on where you are and who you are, both where you are geographically and where you are in the class structure and class relations, how much you benefit from the status quo. And I think that this is a helpful way to start to think about the realities of Palestine and to begin to think about the climate movement's responsibilities and commitments to the struggle for Palestinian liberation. I think we know that often the climate movement is both necessarily and historically oriented to view oil, gas, other extractive industries as our most straightforward enemy, which is obviously not wrong. We need to transition. But I think that sometimes the military-industrial complex can get left out of our analyses about what shapes our present material conditions and what that means for what's shaping our future, our collective future. And this it needs to be acknowledged as we acknowledge that so much of what exists right now needs to be radically transformed if we're trying to win this fight. At CCP, Rafi shared that quote from Gustavo Petro, where he roughly said that Gaza is the first experiment in considering all of us disposable. And that's something that we've returned to a lot at Climate and Community Project. I think one of the ways that I'm thinking about it, in addition to what was framed earlier, is that we can't avoid the genocide in Palestine. We can't avoid the ongoing Nakba, because this fight that we see right now is actually the same as our fight for climate justice, and shying away from like a realistic understanding of what's happening in the world. It's not only morally reprehensible, it's just not a winning strategy, and we shouldn't be taking up losing strategies. So the experiment, in Petro's words, obviously didn't start on October 7th. I won't spend too much time on history. We have a lot to get through, but we know that Gaza has spent the past 16 years under a catastrophic blockade, decades more under occupation. Next month marks 76 years since the Nakba, or catastrophe, which was the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians, the razing of 500 villages, internal displacement of countless more. Many of the people in Gaza are actually refugees from other parts of historic Palestine. And of course, the beginning of 75 years of settler colonial rule. And the Nakba, or catastrophe, isn't understood as a one-time event. It's an ongoing process that spans decades of denial of Palestinian political rights and rights to exist. And today's genocide that we see with its continued and unconditioned US support is made possible within this context of decades of dehumanization, dispossession, and denial of rights. So the devastation of Palestinian educational institutions is mentioned, infrastructure, the bombings of schools, universities, archives in Gaza, routine demolitions, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank to enable settler expansion. All of these are attempts to diminish the physical, social, and cultural infrastructure of Palestinian society. And they're familiar to us, or at least they should be familiar to us in the West, because we are also living in settler colonial societies. You can, so in Palestine, Palestinians have had water and well access stolen from them. And then on top of that, they're forced to pay Israeli companies for water access. That's an example of some of the systems of water apartheid. And even like really innocuous cultural activities like foraging are prohibited and criminalized by the Israeli state. I included this picture in the slide. It's a picture of a Palestinian village, Safria, and the picture in front is the village as it stood in 1948. And in the same site now is pictured behind it. So it's been completely planted over by a pine forest that was sponsored by the Jewish National Fund, which is an organization that was founded alongside the Zionist movement in the early 20th century, to buy land and property in historic Palestine. And the JNF exists today. You can see its website on the right there. And it basically functions to enable Palestinian displacement by establishing national parks on top of ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages, and they designate the land, quote unquote, for conservation purposes. And this is something that would be familiar to us in the US, if you're familiar with like the national park system. So Israel, it's an apartheid settler state. It's obviously an apartheid settler state, and it's in part gained its support by greenwashing the ethnic cleansing that it's been engaging with for decades, by claiming to represent this kind of project that can be endorsed externally, even if internally it's not only ethnic cleansing, but extremely ecologically and environmentally destructive. And this is all part of a process to sanitize its reputation, and continue the erasure of Palestinian people, culture, and land. And now, I mean, coming back to today, 6 months since October 7th, we know that Israel has continued to run just an unrestrained campaign of collective punishment in Gaza. The most recent estimates, it's like unspeakable. More than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. Estimates are 1/3 of the people killed were children. It's more children than have ever been killed in any conflict in modern times. Nearly all of the medical infrastructure is totally destroyed. Thousands of people remain unaccounted for. We know that the vast majority of Gaza's surviving residents have been displaced to the southern border, more than 1 million people at dire risk of starvation. In addition to that, more than 1/3 of agricultural lands in Gaza have been damaged, looking until early January of this year, along with 1 in 5 greenhouses, 1/3 of the irrigation infrastructure. Much of this damage was concentrated in the north, which is Palestine's primary grain producing region, which spiked up prices of wheat by 4 times. All of which are contributing not only to the starvation that people are suffering, but will continue to have devastating effects on the environment. Recent studies from the Center of International and Strategic Studies show that all 5 of Gaza's wastewater treatment plants and most of its sewage pumping stations have also been forced to shut down. That was as early as mid-November of last year. Obviously, water, health, and sanitation infrastructure is critical for keeping people healthy, and this will be an ongoing problem for Gaza as people. Well, we can talk about what happens next later, but all of this is to say that it's not just the devastation of it's not just immediate devastation of people's buildings. It's targeted and systematic destruction of the systems on which people in Gaza rely. Before the invasion, about 25% of Gaza's power was distributed solar. Much of that is destroyed now. Its sole diesel-fired power station stopped in October. There's very little power generation happening in Gaza right now, and it will be very difficult for this to be rebuilt, which Patrick will get into a bit later as well. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, thanks. So this is just a slide that shows the cost of damage, the monetary cost of damage that Israel's inflicted on Gaza, and these numbers are proportions of the total monetary losses, about 18.5 billion, which is about the same as Gaza's annual GDP. And the systematic and targeted destruction of Palestinian people, the land, agriculture, educational systems, medical systems, cultural institutions, all of this clearly amounts to genocide within this broader history of ongoing Nakba or catastrophe. I'm going to hand it off to Patrick now to carry us through the rest of his research before we open for more questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Batul. And so now I want to pivot to some of the climate costs of the ongoing genocide in Gaza so far, based on research that I did with my colleague Ben Nymark and a couple of other folks in the UK. And I want to caveat this by saying that the direct carbon costs of the ongoing genocide is definitely not the most important reason to continue to demand a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. Every single human life at risk on both sides of that border are really good reasons to demand an immediate ceasefire. But this is just another data point for thinking about the ramifications of genocide and settler colonial violence. It's instructive for another number of reasons, including understanding the long-term impacts of war, the U.S. role in the invasion and genocide, and a further demonstration of the fundamental asymmetry of forces at play here. And so these numbers are just the first 60 days after the horrifying attacks of October 7th. We can see that the vast preponderance of emissions from military operations since October 7th have accrued to Israel. We quantified all of the flights, all of the ground vehicles we could accurately tally, all of the munitions. We tried to balance it with a little bit of quantifying the emissions emanating from Gaza as well. But we can see that those are really don't stack up to what the sheer firepower and associated carbon emissions that Israel brings to this war. The other main thing to note here, though, is in the grand scheme of things, these are not tremendously significant greenhouse gas emissions. They're relatively small. The larger carbon impacts of this conflict accrue in what is going to needed to rebuild Gaza, not just to the state that it was before, but in a way that is safer as the climate crisis intensifies. We found that based on the number of buildings and other infrastructure that have been destroyed in those first 3 months of the conflict, are roughly equivalent to the emissions of the country of New Zealand. So again, not a huge volume in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, but as David Boyd, the UN's Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Environment, said to the Guardian reporter who was covering this piece, quote, "Armed conflict pushes humanity even closer to the precipice of climate catastrophe, and it is an idiotic way to spend our shrinking carbon budget," which I think sums it up pretty neatly. These are some other ways of visualizing some of these emissions numbers from the get-go, courtesy of the Guardian, who covered our initial working paper, and those are available online. And again, just to reiterate that the real carbon costs of the genocide will come from rebuilding, which again is not the most important reason to demand an immediate ceasefire, but are really emblematic of bad decisions that are killing tens of thousands of people and will kill many, many thousands more through the impacts of war and the climate crisis in a future without a dramatic change of course. Now let's start to zoom out a little bit to show how the ongoing genocide in Gaza is fundamentally impossible without material support and diplomatic cover from North American and European governments, and none more so than the US. In addition to long-running blocks on UN Security Council ceasefire resolutions for months, and then declaring the ceasefire resolution that did pass as non-binding, among other diplomatic and supranational maneuvering to support Israeli aggression, the US is far and away the largest exporter of arms to Israel, both through purchases and through aid. As you can see, the specific US munitions that have been used in attacks on Palestinian civilians, as well as demonstrating how US aid commitments to Israel have increased over the previous 2.5 decades, and now are set to escalate even further.
Okay, so just while we're waiting for Patrick to log back on, maybe a power cut or some internet issues, Batul, maybe I could ask you a few questions about some of the research that you presented, and we'll chat a bit until we can get Patrick back on. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. Okay. So I thank you for your part of the presentation. I'm really struck that climate justice movements are often kind of really broad and diverse movements that are global in scope, often kind of a planetary complaint, right? But they're also then often very locally rooted in specific places, in specific cities. I guess the question I want to ask you, based on your research and your activism and advocacy, why must movements outside of Palestine and the region really kind of engage the struggle of Palestinian liberation? And what are some of these through lines in your research that you found from Gaza to climate vulnerable communities throughout the world that can spark some of these international organizing and mobilizing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'll answer more from my perspective from the organizing that I've been doing in mostly New York, but also somewhat nationally in the US. I mean, what's true, what the past 6 months have definitely shown is that the movement for Palestinian liberation and self-determination is also extremely wide and globally popular. Like, we are the global majority. The global majority understands that what's the genocide, not just the genocide is wrong, but the occupation needs to end, apartheid needs to end. And that's demonstrated in polling in the US, which shows like the majority of people across parties disapprove of what Israel is doing. And then even in broader terms, if like you look at how the US sits on the UN Security Council, like it's a lonely but vociferous defender of Israel. It's not a popular position to be pro-genocide. At the same time, I think we've seen that our many movements have kind of come together in a particularly strong way because we've had a unifying demand. At least in the US, this unifying demand has first and foremost been for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, an immediate end to the genocide. And that's allowed a ton of different groups to come together and really widen the lane for what's possible in terms of bringing people on to support for Palestine, into solidarity with Palestinians. So I think that we've seen like a real shift in the left landscape in terms of what's possible and who we can bring together. So like newfound support in the labor movement for Palestine, where even like pretty middle of the road labor unions in the US are coming out in support of an end to the genocide because it's what their members are demanding. I think the same is true, like we have in the electoral space, that there's a level of support for Palestine at the federal level that's unprecedented. It's still very low and not where it needs to be, but it's been made possible by the amount of people who are willing to speak out at this point. Then at the same time, obviously, this demand an immediate ceasefire, we still haven't won it, right? So even though we're the majority, we haven't yet built as the left the level of organization that we need to actually challenge the power and scale of the US imperial infrastructure, which is just like so overwhelming when you start to think about it. But at least at Climate and Community Project and like with my work with DSA, with the eco-socialists, our sort of theory of change is that we can't just sit within our own, within our existing coalitions. Like we need to be broadening outside. We need to be bringing people in if we want to win at the scale that's needed. And if we want to win climate action, whether that's a free Palestine or a decarbonized systems, we need many, many more people on our side and empowered to make this happen. And I think that what's been like, what I'm grateful for, like it's been a hellish 6 months, obviously, but what has been sort of heartening is the fact that so many new organizations and relationships are being built, and have been built over the recent years that are kind of creating the scaffolding for this kind of mass movement that has not just the size, but also the creativity and the endurance, to grow beyond any one of its individual parts. And the fact that left movements across borders, not just in, the West, but beyond our homes and the place for anti-Zionist organizing, that understands that the struggle against US support for Israel is actually one of its central tasks. So I think from now, I mean, part of our project, it has to be like figuring out how to not just like the connections have started, but we have to figure out how to keep them embedded in our ongoing work. So whether it's in work, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe I can ask you then, I'd love to hear actually what you have to say about the workplace, but just to add on to this question, if we know that these connections are there and they're happening and they're in front of us, what are some of like the obstacles that are still holding the climate and other movements back from building these connections and building this international solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, speaking as someone who's based in the US, I think that one of the pieces that needs to be unlearned is a lot of the propaganda that's just been really deeply ingrained in the US, that thinking or talking about Palestine is something that's reserved for people who understand everything about the history, or people who can speak to every aspect of the history. Like so often you're told that Palestine is just too complicated. Like you hear this on the phones, you hear this when you're talking to people, that like it's 100-year-old religious conflict. It will never make sense to anybody. Like none of this is true. I think that like you can look the genocide that we're seeing today, it's like a level of devastation and depravity that's beyond words, and anyone can look at what's happening in Palestine today and say, actually, it's not complicated to oppose tens of thousands of people being killed and starved to death. And I think it's been a big turning point. And it's also something that you can kind of easily translate and understand in the local context. So like in the US, and in different terms, obviously. So here in the US, we have, emboldened reactionary leadership in that House and Senate, who are pushing to send even more money to aid this genocide, which is just obviously like a bad thing and a wrong thing to do. But they're not just sending more money to aid it, they're taking money away from things that people need. So they're taking money away from the basic services that don't exist in the US, like healthy water systems, asbestos removal in public schools, public transit, canceling student debt. Like there's so many things that people need in their everyday lives that aren't being met. And in new ways, I think members of Congress are tying increases in military spending to increase militarization at the US southern border, gesturing at cutting programs like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is our biggest climate spending bill to date. It's flawed and insufficient, but it's still the biggest climate spending bill. So I think there are ways to be connecting what's happening in Palestine and what the US is doing to support Israel to, the effect that it has to people's everyday issues closer to home. And also, I mean, especially I think coming out of 2020 and the George Floyd uprisings, there's like a new understanding in the US of what over-policing and militarization looks like in our own communities and neighborhoods. Like I live in New York, we have the National Guard in our subway system now. Why, it's clear why, like this is a reaction to austerity. Like the government would rather react to austerity with militarization than it would with investment. But I think that these conversations are kind of easier to find here and to make clear to people than they have been before. And it's an opportunity to seize.
Yeah, I mean, you're pointing really to right that kind of political education that's not always about nuance, but about a connecting kind of like geopolitics to everyday conditions. I think that's totally on point. But I also want to ask you that there is, especially
Oh,
our person of the hour for that. So we'll return to these questions. Patrick, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm so sorry about that. Absolutely mortifying. Been on Zoom all day with no problem. And of course, right when I get to the crescendo, it wants to quit on me.
Well, Batul and I have been having a more interesting conversation, so I'm teasing. Okay, so let's get back on track. Are you good to pick up where you left off, Patrick?
Yeah, I'll just run through our conclusion real quick. I just want to return to this. Well, I'll get to the what is to be done question and return to
Cool.
closing.
If you don't mind returning to some, maybe like a minute or two before you cut off some of the numbers, just so we can get the audience some questions in on those too. That'd be great.
Well, you know what? Let me just get to the punchline here, which is largely that the U.S. military, in terms of its arms exports and also everyday operations, is a major structuring institution in the climate crisis for all number of reasons, including arms exports that are directly used to commit genocide, of course, but also just in the everyday operations of U.S. and other NATO militaries that operate this globe bestriding network of bases that require just unfathomable volumes of fossil fuels to maintain this system that makes it possible to think about the kind of quotes that Rafi and Batul talked about from President Petro in terms of this global climate apartheid, right? That we are seeing a form of that there are many ways that apartheid manifests in Gaza. One of them is through climate apartheid, and that this is a sort of structuring logic that is increasingly playing out across the world. And so in order to undo that and begin to contend with that, we really need a reparative strategy for climate justice in Palestine and beyond. But of course starts with an immediate ceasefire and an end to global North military aid to Israel, an immediate and massive scale up in assistance to Palestine to rebuild resiliently, along with a whole other suite of things that need to happen in terms of shrinking the military industrial complex. Because like Petra said, the life of humanity, and especially the people of the South, depends on the way in which humanity chooses the path to overcome the climate crisis produced by the wealth of the North. Gaza, once again, is the first experiment in considering us all disposable. And we see this playing out as borders become hardened, as global North countries begin to seriously invest in adaptation, while global South countries are offered nothing but further debt to try to contend with a crisis that they play a little role in creating. And all of these other manifestations. And so we would argue that to confront the drivers of climate breakdown are also to confront the drivers of apartheid, militarism, and perpetual war. And an immediate permanent ceasefire in Palestine and into all occupation and apartheid is the only viable path towards lasting peace, security, and survival in the climate crisis. So let's get on to Q&A. I'm very, very sorry about that.
It's all good. Thank you, Patrick. So I want to follow up with some of this research that you've been doing with Ben as well. So you've shared some of these numbers. Could you kind of bring us into a little bit of the impetus for starting that work? And I think more importantly, what you hope people take away from those emission numbers as you keep releasing them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been working on quantifying the climate impacts of the U.S. military with Ben at Queen Mary University for a long time. And honestly, that work, I saw that Emily Gilbert was on this call. That work was motivated in part by her great work in the early 2010s on the militarization of climate change. And I really recommend reading that to everyone on this call to think about the problematics of reducing climate change to a series of military metaphors and practices. So that's kind of where that comes from. But Ben came back from COP, like you said, that saying that everybody was talking about Gaza, but there just wasn't much information on the climate angle. And so we decided to do it. And COP was also interesting, I think, because this is the first time that a host had put military emissions on the table as a topic for discussion. And that's an important break historically, because there was a specific carve out for militaries built into Kyoto, re-upped in Paris. And now, so militaries have basically been given a free pass from global climate processes. There's a few other motivations. By the time we started this work in January, Global North media coverage on Gaza was starting to tail off. And so this is a way to try to bring the focus back there through, what the mechanisms that we had at our disposal. And it also honestly reflects my and our climate community project's frustration with a lot of climate groups and even some supposedly critical foreign policy, economic policy groups that hadn't said anything about Gaza or even signed on to statements demanding a ceasefire. And so I said it a little bit facetiously at the time, but I think it's more true than I'd like. For a certain kind of centrist concerned about climate change, this was like an entry point, like almost permission to say like, hey, what's happening in Gaza is terrible. And so it's just a way of trying to broaden the coalition a little bit. Again, I don't think that this is the most important reason to care about Gaza by any stretch of the imagination, but if it is a reason that brings people into these discussions, I think it's positive. And I mean, there's a number of like scholastic reasons. It's an interesting intellectual challenge, and there's folks who've been working on methodologies to quantify emissions from war. But the main thing I want people to take away from these numbers is like the fundamental asymmetry between Israel and Palestine that's been produced over the last 75 years. We can see that in the emissions numbers. And Gazans have so little access to like just about everything as a result of apartheid and collective punishment that these numbers really bear out clearly some of the problematics there. And then just in the macro, I really hope that people will continue to increasingly see militarism and the global political economy of violence that it co-constitutes as a really critical terrain of struggle for climate justice and something that we can really be fighting and have to be fighting at home.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. From your research, I'm also struck by the extent it takes to get some of this data, to speculate, to abstract some of this data. I'm really taken by one of your calls for transparent military pollution data. Could you share with our audience just why that has to be a call in the first place, and then what the significance is to combating some of these root drivers of the climate crisis and the genocide, which of course is militarism and the military-industrial complex?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the military emissions reporting is a fundamental issue of data justice, and that we should be able to have a clear view. Militaries are very often the largest emitter within national governments, and are very much within their control and within their purview. And so it is entirely possible for governments to rapidly reduce emissions from military operations, not through like greening the military or any mealy mouth stuff like that. Like these emissions are locked in unless they just stop. You know, you don't spend $1 trillion on an F-35 fighter program to not fly those planes, right? No matter how energy hungry they are. And so they just have to be mothballed. That's really the path that we would advocate. And then how this came to be, and this is one of the sort of lesser known bad outcomes, I think, of Kyoto in '92. I think a lot about, you know, the role that the US played in forcing market mechanisms into, you know, carbon trading and carbon offsetting and these kinds of things that the US forced into Kyoto and then famously, of course, never signed. But this military carve-out exemption was another one of these bad outcomes that we are still recovering from 32 years later, and we still don't have good comprehensive reporting. NATO has just proposed a military emissions reporting scheme, but it leaves quite a lot to be desired, especially if we're thinking about the full supply chain climate impacts of building and using military weaponry.
Totally. I'd encourage our audience to put some questions for Patrick and Batul into the chat, and we'll move on to those soon. I want to ask you though, Patrick, so emissions are of course important, right? Essential kind of struggle around climates. But what are some of the other ecological ramifications of like decades of siege and occupation that are maybe like related to some of these emissions that you're tracking, or symptoms of some of these things, but maybe are not fully captured by these like abstracted statistics? Like what other kind of ecological ramifications have you found in your CCP research?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I have to say that we lean a lot on some great Palestinian scholars and environmental activists who have done the work cataloging this. This is not primary research by us by any stretch of the imagination. I'd really encourage folks to read our ceasefire statement for links to those folks' work. I think the first thing that I want to say about this, and this is something that I've learned and has really been hammered into my head through a decade of collaboration with Professor Jess Dempsey at UBC, that climate is just one sort of plank of a broader ecological crisis that includes biodiversity loss. It includes the loss of agricultural topsoil, water availability, food insecurity, and so on. And so climate is just one sort of piece of this if we're thinking about not just climate justice, but really full spectrum environmental justice that we have to consider. Climate is an important part of, but it's not the only part. And so you know, there's all sorts of things, and we tried to foreground this a little bit with Batul's section of the talk, just because there's so many, and it's so hard to catalog them, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, even before the current invasion, the World Bank said that only 1% of Gazans had consistent access to clean water. The West Bank has long been treated as a sacrifice zone where toxic industry and wastewater are concentrated. Israel also pumps the groundwater directly out from under it Palestinians, and Israelis use 5 times more water per capita than Palestinians do. And I think, and there's a lot more that we could talk about, but one thing to say is that all these challenges are only going to get more intense as the climate crisis intensifies. Climate projections forecast that all of historic Palestine and then the Eastern Mediterranean more broadly will experience intensifying extreme temperatures and drought. And Palestinians are much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than people just, you know, across the fence. And then the other thing to note is that the Palestinian Environmental NGO Network has done a lot of work documenting how environmental defenders are imprisoned on charges of public incitement and repeatedly harassed by the Israeli state, which is really reflective of the broader criminalization and persecution of Palestinian human rights defenders. So basically, if there's an environmental challenge that you've looked at elsewhere in the world, it has its own specific cadence and dimensions in Palestine, but it's also a challenge that Gazans and folks in the West Bank and in refugee camps across the border in Lebanon or Syria are also facing.
Thanks, Patrick. Batul, I want to turn back to you and pick up on a thread of a conversation we were having. So you were calling for kind of a political education, right? That was based in a kind of moral outrage but also connecting to people's everyday lives here in North America, right? I'm also wondering, though, the role of some of this of Palestinian history and the history of occupation as well. So, like decontextualizing the current genocide, right, outside of decades-long occupation and siege, has been a sort of central tactic in dehumanizing Palestinians and enabling genocide. So I'm curious, in your view, what parts of this history are fundamental for environmental and climate justice movements and organizers to learn and understand and mobilize as they're mobilizing solidarity in North America?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that there are lots of great resources for learning about Palestinian history in depth, and I'm happy to share lots of resources out afterwards. I think in terms of like ways to think about it is really just deeply understanding that Israel is a settler colonial project, and it is actually a history that's reflected in our own history. So in the same way that we think about the US as a settler colonial state and the injustices of our practices of diminishing and ignoring indigenous sovereignty on our land, like a lot, like there's so many echoes in what's happened in Palestine. So I mentioned how like foraging has been criminalized in Israel, how there are these systems of water apartheid that are that are created in historical Palestine or occupied Palestine, where people's not just their land, but their rights to the water and the land, their access to wells is taken away, and then they're forced to pay Israeli companies in order to access that water and use the water for agricultural systems that are then, later encroached upon and destroyed in whether through settlement or through, as we're seeing in the invasion of Gaza, like destruction of land, bulldozing of land. And I think that this is just a piece, this is central to the Israeli project, and you can't understand what's happening in Palestine without understanding sort of like the basic building blocks of what it means to be a settler colonial project. And as I was sort of saying before, I think that's something that it is really, there's a big attempt to like obfuscate that when we're talking about Palestine today, especially in the US, where people on the right, where this like Zionists want you to understand what's happening as like a impossibly complicated religious conflict that is simply irresolvable, and therefore we shouldn't even try to like think about it, and it's beyond the realms of our comprehension. But actually it's like part of our lived experience too. And it could be part of our future if we allow these systems to continue, and if we don't think about the many, many ways that like as Patrick is saying, like the military industrial complex is not just something that happens abroad. It's something that seeps into every one of our systems here. So thinking about over policing, thinking about our incarceration system, about the militarization of our borders, like this is an industry that needs to be considered with the same amount of seriousness as we consider the oil and gas and fossil fuel industry. And if we don't do that, then we're missing a huge part of the fight. And that's not setting ourselves up to win, like you have to think about these things together if you're thinking about them seriously. So I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of there's so much history, but I really hate to like say that there's one piece of history to focus on, because I feel like that you can look at your own history, you can look at the US history, you can look at Palestinian history, and like the forces are the same and our struggle is the same. So I wouldn't want to say like, oh, look to this conference in 1958 or whatever, because this is the world that we live in, and like it needs to be engaged with it as it exists today.
Totally, right. The through lines might become more obvious when we look to our everyday lives as well. I think that's a great answer, Batul. So I just have one last question that I want to pose to both of you. I'd like to hear from both of you if you'd like to answer this question, and then we'll move on to some great questions we have from the audience before closing up. So I this is kind of our wrap up question for this section. So what might the failure of climate movements and scholars to engage Palestine and the Palestinian question mean for the future of climate justice advocacy and organizing? Patrick, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the pithiest answer that I have to this is something that we wrote in our initial kind of Twitter thread about this that then later became the brief, that apartheid is incompatible with climate justice, but inevitable without it. And because we take an internationalist approach, we truly believe that there is climate justice everywhere, or there is no climate justice. If we continue, my understanding is that things are broadly similar in Canada as they are in the US, and that climate movements are often very much inward looking, thinking about, national decarbonization plans, thinking about adaptation strategies municipally. And, it probably is possible to get to, if not absolute zero, net zero emissions, whatever that means in the US or Canada or whatever, as those extractive industries and dirty manufacturing processes are offshored further, while the benefits continue to accrue to northern companies and countries, giving them the resources available to contend with the climate crisis, while folks in the global south are effectively abandoned to their own devices. And so I think the stakes genuinely could not be higher, and this is just a clearing call to, in your climate organizing, consider the global dimensions or the international dimensions, or this, even if you're taking a sectoral approach, thinking about the global supply chains that make decarbonization possible, that, are enabling an EV transition or whatever. It just, I don't know. I can't say anything more except that it is absolutely a moral and practical imperative to build in internationalism to our advocacy from the start.
Thanks, Patrick. Betul.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, so the question is, what does the failure to take on and engage with Palestine and Palestine solidarity mean for climate justice advocacy? I think it's just like a really clear indication, if that happens, that the climate movement, or so-called climate movement as it exists, is willing to leave most vulnerable people behind in the climate crisis, and that's a really bad forecast for the future. So like we see that there's kind of consensus around protecting interests of fossil fuel companies within the establishment. In the same way, there's consensus around continued funding for, the US's main client state, Israel, even as it's formally charged with genocide. Like, I think this just makes so clear that maintaining flows of capital, maintaining international shipping routes, as we saw with the targeting of Yemen and Yemenis, Israel's been bombing Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, humanitarian aid convoys, really anyone who gets in the way. All of these bombings are funded by the US. These are targeted killings. And I think that like buying into this logic that just like is the continuation of capitalism and imperialism over people's lives and ecological thriving and safety it should be really familiar to people who work in climate action. And I think it just is important for us to be really consistent about in our work, if we want our work to have like solidity and strength and like lasting power, and like how do you say it, like, and to be real to people who are looking for actual solutions to the problems in their lives. So like not just thinking about putting, I work on schools a lot in my everyday life. And so like not just putting, solar panels on a crumbling school, but thinking about the asbestos inside the building, and the fact that there aren't enough teachers, and the fact that like kids can't get to school, and so they're skipping school, and truancy rates are, you know what I mean? Like there're just all these other aspects of what we need to be fixing with climate action, and letting Palestine fall away from what we're doing is, I think, just pretty devastating for the movement.
Thanks, Betul. So let's move now to some questions from the audience. I'll read some of these audience questions, and either of you can take them up, or both. So here's a question about not just grassroots organizing, but other kinds of organizing. So an audience member asks, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the role of large environmental organizations in pressing for a ceasefire. With COP27, we saw very, very little uptake, if at all, in the connections between political freedoms and climate justice with many of these big green orgs. So what are some ways for mobilizing these big greens towards the issue of ceasefire? Or is getting them on board actually not where we should be, where we should spend our organizing energy?
Patrick, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, for one thing that I would say is that one thing that I've learned from transitioning from academia to, the sort of policy world is that the big green NGOs are not monolithic. There are often very good people who do share this perspective within those organizations, and they need to be supported so that they can advocate within their orgs to be able to speak up and say something, while at the same time also recognizing that organizations like, but it's the Sierra Club that runs kind of tourist trips to Israeli national parks, right? And like is part of like basically complicit in Israeli greenwashing and papering over the displacement that occurred to found those parks, right? So both these things can be true. There are good people that need our support, while at the same time they do need to be challenged. And so to the extent that they can be brought along, or sort of cadre within those organizations can be brought along, I think that's great. But I'm not sure that it isn't a better use of our time to work with like a lot of the community organizations that a lot of folks on this call probably do, and talking to them about Palestine and making that part of their outlook as well. And once that becomes common sense, which I think it increasingly is, I think we've actually made progress on this over the last 4 months or so, and hopefully we will continue to do so. Maybe that creates consensus that the big greens can then follow on. I don't know. I'm not sure about it as an organizing strategy, but it seems plausible.
So there's lots of questions here asking about your slides, Patrick. And if you feel comfortable, we'd love to share those with the audience. So everybody who's registered will get access to those. And there's some more technical questions here about the research, but I want to put those on pause. I'll come back to those. Just still on organizing, there's a great question here that asks, demilitarization politically poses the same huge problem for the US left as decarbonization. Some of the strongest unions in the US represent employees who work for the military, industrial, fossil fuel complex. We're trying to build a working class movement, but this poses a major obstacle to solidarity. Thoughts? Question mark. I'm sure one of you can solve this.
Patrick, do you want to go ahead, or I can jump in first?
Yeah, go for it. I'll come in later if I've got anything.
Yeah, I would maybe add another piece to this, which is some of the strongest social infrastructure, at least in the US, is also through the military. Like I'm thinking about like the VA and veteran healthcare is like actually sort of like a universal healthcare system that we have embedded within a certain section of the US. So it's not just unions, it's a bigger question, I think, that is real. I think that so thinking about military industrial fossil complex separate from like military workers, I think that you're right. It's the same question as like, what's a just transition? I think like the key piece of a just transition is you need to be creating jobs that are not only like better paid, higher quality, but also jobs that people want to work in. And I think that in some of the conversations that Patrick and I have had, and Patrick is really holding this work at CCP, but some of the conversations we've had with workers who are working in manufacturing sectors is that they know how to do their jobs better than their bosses know how to do their jobs, right? This is like a key piece of labor in the climate crisis, is that workers have the skills to actually transition us to the systems that we need to be building. And I think that returning some of the power to workers to guide the kinds of industries that they want to be invested in, they want to be working in, is a piece of this. I think that making that choice easier is like a big part of what our problem is, or our challenge is right now in the US, is like, how do we make the things that we need to be built a better for workers and better for communities than the things that we don't want to be built right now. So that's just like a basic answer to it. But it is, I think you're right in posing this question. Like, it's a question of just transition. And I think it's also a question of building out sort of the universal social infrastructure that we need in the US, so that people aren't as reliant on systems like the military to get access to things that everyone should have access to, like debt-free education and a healthcare system and a retirement plan and a pension plan, and all of these things that are like actually very difficult to get.
And yeah, I definitely co-sign all of that. It's a problem that we are just now starting to grapple with as our next major research project on this. I would point the questionnaire to some of the work that they've been doing over on the other side of the Atlantic in the UK. Our friends at Commonwealth are basically trying to resurrect the spirit of what was called the Lucas Plan in the late 1970s, where British aerospace workers, not from BAE Systems, but from Lucas Aerospace, started to demand more socially useful work than building the weapons of war, and repurposing, including building things like heat pumps in the late 70s, the exact kind of kit that we need now for the climate crisis. And so I think it's just going to be a lot of hard work with a lot of hard conversations with labor. Some folks in the labor movement are already starting to have those conversations. We've also seen some really incredibly encouraging signs from some of our congressional members about finally there's a little bit of, there's some cracks appearing in the, hard consensus on ever escalating military budgets. But we don't take on small problems, I guess. This is a massive challenge and we're not going to solve it overnight. And there's a lot of dimensions that we probably haven't even considered yet, but we definitely won't solve them if we don't try.
So there's another question here. It's a yes or no question. Is there a preprint available with updated figures for carbon emissions from Israel's genocide, Patrick? But a more technical question, do NDCs from any country take into account military emissions? These are nationally determined contributions, right?
Yeah, that's right. As far as preprint go, and what we have out is the preprint. This is a working paper. We are updating those figures and it's going in for submission and will be under peer review as of next week, if nobody's schedule gets disrupted. So fingers crossed. As far as militaries showing up in NDCs, I mean, this is like part of the military carve out. Some countries have started reporting, and are, NATO countries in particular are saying they're going to begin integrating them. Unsurprisingly, I guess the Nordics and France are furthest along in that, but it is far from universal. And as far as if they're actually showing up in the NDCs themselves, I couldn't tell you, but there is more self-reporting and pathways supposedly to lowering the carbon intensity of militaries, although I do think that's a bit of a red herring.
So we got one more question here. We know that the Eastern Mediterranean is going to be horribly affected by climate change in the coming decades. Do you two have any thoughts about the future of Palestine beyond apartheid and how that relates to the climate future of the region more broadly?
I guess I'll just come in real quick, and Batul might have some deeper thoughts than I do on this, just because this is not a region that I'm a specialist in by any stretch of the imagination. I think in addition to all the really urgent challenges that are being produced by the genocide and just the massive destruction is really indicative of challenges that are facing, not that the global south is a monolith by any stretch of the imagination, but the problems of like accessing finance to build pathways to low carbon development, or to pay for the adaptive infrastructure necessary, or to transition to different kinds of agricultural systems. For me, just from the stuff that I think about on a day-to-day basis, one of the main challenges is going to be on access to capital, and the other will be capacity to implement that, as Rafi said, with the process of scholasticide that's underway, but also the starvation of the creation of an effective Palestinian state that Israel has choked for so long. There's just a lot of administration that has to get done in order to take climate action and do it at a scale that it is beneficial to everyone in society. And so there's a kind of governance question there, that governance structures are often gutted by World Bank and IMF funding packages that themselves are often pushing countries across the global south, and even an independent Palestine would be beholden to the same sorts of predatory financial inclusion that international financial institutions are perpetuating around the world under the rubric of climate action right now.
I don't have much to add to that. Other than that, I think it's a great question, and also a reason why, like I was saying earlier, like our main unifying demand has been a ceasefire now, and we haven't reached that yet. But even once we do, the question of other peoples and countries being allowed to have self-determination is like so crucial for any kind of climate resilience, if you want to use that word, like Patrick is saying, whether it's financial or political or social, like we should be keeping this question central in our work in many different spaces. Obviously, right now, there's rightfully a ton of attention on Palestine because we need to end the genocide, but this should be consistent throughout the rest of our work as well.
I think that's totally right, Batul. I think especially in this region, to kind of just add to this question, the aridness of the region is often framed as the primary characteristic that we need to kind of plan and manage, right? So it's always that technical focus. But the real issue here, right, is distribution and denial, which obviously have technical demands, but also are fundamentally social, political, economic questions as well, right? Okay, so I think we'll close up there. Thank you to everyone for sticking through us with some of these technical difficulties. We will get you these slides through email somehow over the next coming days, so you can kind of catch up what you missed there. Thanks to our guests, Batul and Patrick, and special thanks to Katie McChesney and Jack Suchodolski at the CCJ for all of the organizational support and for finding Patrick in his hiatus. So we'll end there. Thank you for joining us. Again, if you want to see any of the research that Patrick and Batul have shared, it's also at climateandcommunity.org. Thanks.